It's go time, Richmond.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Richmond's Morning News. My name is Rich Herrera. Appreciate you hanging out with us this morning. James River Air Text Line, 833-804-1140. Now, this one's going to get some people fired up. The Supreme Court today is expected to deliver a couple big decisions. They waited to the very, very end. One is on birthright citizenship. The other is trans athletes in girls' sports. To discuss this, let's go out to the WRVA Newsmaker Hotline. Zack Smith is joining us. He's a senior legal fellow, and manager of the Supreme Court and Appellate Advocacy Program for the Heritage Foundation. And he's our special guest here on News Radio WRVA. Good morning, sir.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Okay, let me back up for just a second. We saw a couple cases come down yesterday. A couple decisions came down yesterday that had conservatives scratching their heads at the way the court reacted when it came to states counting their votes. And then we had one where it went for the Trump administration. I hear so many people on the left wanting to say that this court is just a rubber stamp for this administration. Therefore, we need to pack the court. Well, yesterday, obviously, the Trump administration didn't get everything they wanted. When people talk about this court and the way that John Roberts will look for consensus and Amy Coney Barrett will sometimes side with the liberal justices, how do you respond when somebody goes, well, this court needs to be packed because it's just a rubber stamp for Donald Trump?
Well, that's just nonsense. They're either bad-faced political actors or they just don't know what they're talking about. And to your point, I think we saw that yesterday. And we've seen that over the past few weeks where we've seen odd ideological lineups in a couple of cases. You have Justice Neil Gorsuch joining Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in an opinion in one of the cases recently released. But look, I think what we saw yesterday in the two cases involving presidential power, Trump versus Slaughter and Trump versus Cook, and what we saw in the election integrity case as well, is that there's not even always consensus among the conservative justices. That's why you saw splits with Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Barrett, Justice Gorsuch, shifting around where they joined their colleagues in some of these decisions. So, look, it's hard to fit this court into a neat ideological box, but certainly packing the court, changing the composition of the court to increase the number of justices, that's just a terrible idea.
We're talking with Zack Smith from Heritage Foundation right now on News Radio WRVA. I'm a conservative, but I also understand the court's job is to keep the legislative and executive branches in checks. We have those where each of these pillars of our government will not let one get bigger than the other. I actually don't mind when you have cases that will go against the executive branch or the legislative branch, because it shows me that the system of checks and balances is working. And I kind of scratch my head sometimes. Conservatives will almost expect this court to be, well, they always have to rule conservatively. If it's bad law, it's bad law.
Well, look, I agree with that in principle, but here's the problem from a practical perspective. What happens too often is that it looks like judges or justices are imposing their own policy preferences in order to check the Trump administration or in order to check laws that Congress has passed. That is not the role of the courts to impose their own policy preferences. They are supposed to interpret the law and the Constitution as those instruments are written. And what happened in some of the cases yesterday, what happened in some of the cases over the past few weeks, it looks a lot like the court is deciding some of these cases on policy grounds or imposing their own policy views in lieu of those put forward by the Trump administration. Now, I think we've certainly seen that in the lower federal courts.
Right.
But I think what frustrates many conservatives is it appears like the justices and the judges are doing something other than simply interpreting the law.
Sometimes it's me. It's just me. It almost seems like we get make goods. I missed that one yesterday. Let me make good on this call today.
Well, I certainly hope that's not the case. Look, yesterday, there was one big win for the Trump administration, the Trump versus Slaughter case. That's where the court reaffirmed that the president can actually be the president. I talked about this on my X feed at TZ Smith. That's at TZ Smith, where I broke down that case. But essentially, the court said that Congress cannot restrict the ability of the president to hire and fire whom he pleases to help carry out his policies. Now, that case in Slaughter involving the Federal Trade Commission, that was a little bit in tension with the decision the court reached in the Trump versus Cook case, where the court said that for now, at least, President Trump cannot fire Lisa Cook, who is a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Now, both of those opinions were by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Cook case, it was on very narrow grounds. It came to the court in a slightly different procedural posture. So there's going to be further lower court litigation in this Cook case. But I think when you talk about head scratchers, that's something many people were scratching their heads at a little bit yesterday, saying that these two cases were somewhat hard to reconcile.
Okay, so let's get to what we might see today. Birthright citizenship is where I want to start. What is before the court? What are you thinking your tea leaves tell you?
Well, I joke my crystal ball is cloudy. It's hard to predict what the justices are going to do in any case.
Wait a second, can I stop you for a second? Is that a good thing?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I can tell you this. I can tell you what the justices should do. I think the Trump administration has very strong legal arguments for the president's positions. And in fact, there's been a lot of legal scholarship confirming that the president is taking a correct position here, that really the president's position is one that is long overdue. It should have been argued long ago. And here's the crux of the argument. If you look at the 14th Amendment, it says that anyone born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof shall be a citizen of the United States. And it's that and subject to the jurisdiction thereof language that has a very important, very technical meaning, but has been read out of our Constitution for so many years. Now, even though the justices should decide this case in President Trump's favor, if you listen to the oral arguments, it seemed like some of the justices were skeptical of this position. And so I think many legal commentators are bracing for maybe an adverse ruling for the Trump administration. But we'll have to wait and see what the justices do.
Now, on the trans athlete issue that's before the court, what are we looking at? What do you see?
Well, look, I think it's really a sad indictment of the state of our country that we even have to have a Supreme Court case saying that only women, biological women, can play in women's sports. And yet that's exactly what's at issue in this case. Idaho and West Virginia and a number of other states too passed that common sense law saying that only women can play in women's sports, only girls can play in girls' sports. And yet there are challengers challenging that law, arguing that that violates Title IX, which is designed to protect women's sports, arguing that it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. But if you listen to the oral arguments in this case, not only should the justices rule in favor of West Virginia and Idaho, which passed these laws, but it seemed like a majority of the justices were very sympathetic to states' ability to do just that.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to play one here on the radio. That's why we have Zack
You're better
Smith.
For it.
That's why I have Zack Smith here. Listen, he went to UF all the way through. Did you ever leave campus, it seems like?
Spent 8 years in God's country. Go Gators.
My wife's not going to like that. She's a Cane, but that's okay. I do want to ask you this one question, though. When it comes to trans athletes, Title IX gets so much play. Everybody talks about it so much. Is Title IX cover sex or gender?
Well, look, it's really a perversion of Title IX that many of these trans athletes, biological men who are trying to transition into women, are using Title IX to try to force states to allow them to participate in women's sports. Because if you look at Title IX was originally passed and designed to provide opportunities for women and girls to participate in athletic endeavors. And really to see trans advocates shoehorn it in this way, really pervert the language of the statute in this way, it really is a sad state of affairs.
Well, that's why I get to that, because I remember when one of the justices was before the committees, what's the definition of woman? And she wouldn't answer. So that's why I go back to Title IX. Title IX was always to provide equal opportunity to women when it comes to educational opportunities, sports, all the rest. So if it's Title IX and we're talking about this transgender athletes, sex is one thing, and I think gender is another, if I'm not mistaken. Is that legally correct?
Well, Title IX, the statutory language does use sex throughout it instead of gender. But look, I think there's been a lot of confusion about these terms. It goes all the way back to the very unfortunate opinion Justice Neil Gorsuch authored in Bostock versus Clayton County, where he held that Title VII protects essentially transgender individuals because in his view, that would be sex-based discrimination. And so I think that's part of the issue courts are needing to work through right now, is trying to distinguish and kind of silo that very bad, very wrong, in my opinion, Bostock opinion, and make sure that that interpretation stays limited to the very narrow facts of the Bostock case.
But there is that precedent then, because of the Bostock case, why sex and gender, there's some confluence between the two then.
Correct. And
okay.
I think, look, from my view, Bostock was wrongly decided. It was a very egregious mistake that Justice Gorsuch made, and I'm hopeful that courts will eventually fix and overturn that decision.
Okay, I know I'm over time, but Dave, let me just ask, if you don't mind, one more question I'm asking my producer. When I have that precedent, if I agree with it or I don't agree with it, is that the law of the land, and that's where I look at this? Maybe it gets changed. Maybe we have the legislature do something different, but that's the precedent that they take, and that's where we kind of look at the rulings unless they change the precedent with an updated ruling?
Well, I think courts have to look at the language of each statute differently and how the framers and ratifiers of each statute would have understood the language. And so that's part of what's happening right now is Title VII and Title IX, they use similar terms, but they're not identical statutes. And so making sure that courts interpret and apply each statute as it reads and as it would have been understood when they were passed.
Zach, I learned something from you today. I think we all did. So I appreciate you coming on the program. By the way, when you were a Gator, were you there at the glory days when you're winning football championships and basketball championships?
2 basketball championships, 2 football championships, and at least since then it's been downhill in football, but hope springs eternal.
Hey, Zach, I enjoy this. We got to get you back on the program again. I love the way you just simply explained in real terms what all we're seeing here and what we're going to look at. So I'd love to get you back on the program.
I'd love to do it. Thanks so much for having me on the show this morning.
All right, take care. Zack Smith joining us from the Heritage Foundation here on News Radio WRVA. I think that's very interesting because I've always wondered that the confluence of gender versus sex, because in a lot of ways legally, I think people get them as synonymous, and are they synonymous or not? But again, with that Gorsuch decision, now I see where that comes into play. All right, today's program is brought to you by Men's Wellness Center. So, guys,